So I got a 503 on my MCAT, the medical college admissions test, and the average historically is 500. So while technically still above average, it's much lower than I was hoping for, and admittedly I was disappointed in it. However, in my defense, I think that it does not necessarily reflect my true ability as a student and test taker because I had not taken some vital courses that are really essential before you actually want to take the MCAT. However, given my timeline, I decided to still take the test because I did not want to take a gap year, and so I was missing classes that you would like to have beforehand, such as the second semester of organic chemistry and biochemistry, which is arguably the most heavily tested concept on the MCAT. However, this was a calculated and acceptable risk, and I decided to go ahead and pull the trigger and take the test anyway because ultimately, once again, I did not want to take a gap year, and I really was just very excited to start this journey. And it all worked out in the end because that 503, in addition to what I think is a very solid application, has landed me multiple acceptances in both DO and MD programs. And we're still very early in the application cycle, so as of today, it's November 4th, 2021. And I submitted the applications for DO and MD programs in May and June respectively. So I'm still waiting to hear back from several schools, and thankfully it did work out in the end for me, and therefore I have no regrets. But that being said, I do have things that I would do differently with present knowledge if I could go back and do it again. So in this video, what I want to do is simply impart some wisdom from these lessons that I've had to learn the hard way, such that any student watching it that is approaching the MCAT can use this wisdom to hopefully make this process of studying for it and taking it a little more efficient and effective. And in this video, I'll be covering how I actually studied, how I should have studied, both things that I would not do again and things that I would do, and then I'll kind of summarize it so you have some take-home points such that you can apply it to your own study program. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. So here's a video on how I would study for the MCAT if I could do it again. Diving into how I actually studied, I read what I believe are all 7 of the Kaplan textbooks, and this took roughly 6 months to do because the books are thick, they're like textbooks, and it's just so much material that even if you're reading every day like I was, it takes time. So I actually had an Excel spreadsheet, I kind of geeked out on it, and I did a breakdown of how many pages I would need to read to finish by a certain date, and I maintained that. I actually exceeded that goal, so I finished early, but it still took a tremendous amount of time. I was also using Anki, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a spaced repetition application that allows you to make smart flashcards, and then it spaces it out using an algorithm that allows you to effectively spend more time on the cards that you're less familiar with and less time on the cards that you're more familiar with. So it's just making your study time more efficient. And despite being a very useful tool in studying, you do have to use it appropriately, and it was definitely an evolutionary process when I started out because I had no prior exposure to Anki, so I was just kind of learning as I went. And in the beginning, I was making my own flashcards straight out of the books as I was reading, and I ran into 2 issues here, really. One was that I was just making way too many flashcards. I think I wasn't even through one book and I already had maybe 3,000 cards. That's just way too many. And then 2, the cards were way too in-depth, way too long, just too much information on one card. The next stage of Anki that I sort of graduated to was using a pre-made deck, and I ran into similar issues here in that they did have a lot of cards, but the number of cards was much more manageable. However, the complexity of the cards was just about the same, if not worse. So I actually had to go in each card and sort of just cut down the content and abbreviate it such that I could remember it without being overwhelmed. And after doing this long enough, again, I sort of realized that it wasn't going to be the most feasible plan. Luckily for me, in the midst of this ongoing struggle with Anki, a company called Med School Insiders came along and developed their own application called Memm, M-E-M-M, and it did something similar to Anki in that they actually had their own flashcards already developed that followed a similar spaced repetition algorithm, and their cards were much shorter, much more concise, and much more manageable to go through while still exposing you to the appropriate quantity and quality of information. I did also dabble into one of the online go at your own pace MCAT courses, although it was fairly short-lived because in addition to all of the things that I was doing, it was very time consuming and just not at the top of my list of things to do. And I very quickly realized that at least for me, it wasn't at the top of my list of priorities in the most effective study program, so I stopped doing it. As I mentioned previously, I had not taken biochemistry leading up to the MCAT, so this is something that I had to try to teach to myself. And so I did that through various resources online and following YouTube videos. And once I thought I had a decent handle on a given concept, I would spend a lot of time drawing different biological pathways and just repetition over that material to try to just sear it into my brain. For example, the Krebs cycle, glycolysis, the pentose phosphate pathway. These are pathways that I would just try to learn and then draw over and over again to try to sear them into my brain. Next up on my study agenda were practice exams and Q banks, and I actually did much less than I originally planned on because of time constraints, but I ended up only doing 4 practice exams and a couple Q banks, and all of them were the double AMC, so that was much less than I had originally planned on, although given the constraints there, I did make a specific point to only study the double AMC material. And so a month after I took the test, I got my score back, saw the 503, was kind of disappointed in it because that's right on the line, honestly, of whether you want to use the score and apply or retake it. It also kind of depends on what schools you're applying to, but given my time constraints, I could have retaken the exam, but I would not have time to dedicate to taking many more practice exams and Q banks because the MCAT takes 7 hours. And so if you're going to do a full length practice exam, it takes 7 hours. And given my school schedule and work schedule, I just didn't have time to do enough of that. There were hardly any days, if any, that I would have had available that semester to actually sit down and take more 7-hour long tests. And so without adequate time to actually dedicate to studying more, to taking more Q banks and practice exams, I actually don't think that it's a good idea to retake the exam. And I'm actually going to quote my pre-med advisor at my school here, IUSB, who was amazing. And she said that you may not want to retake it if you can't dedicate the study time, because there's any number of reasons that you might do bad or relatively bad on a test on any given day. However, if you retake it and you get the same score or worse, that more solidifies their perception in their minds of your capabilities. So with all of this in mind, I decided not to retake it, to keep the 503, to hope that the rest of my application was solid enough such that this wouldn't matter so much, and also kind of praying that someone would see the 503, but also seeing that, hey, he hasn't taken organic chemistry 2 or biochemistry. Holy cow, that's actually not bad. Whether or not this is the actual thought process on the admissions side, I have no idea, but this was me kind of optimistically hoping on my end, and obviously, once again, it did work out. Moving into how I should have studied, starting with things that I would not do again, books are probably the biggest thing that I had regret about. So again, 7 books, textbooks, took me 6 months to read. I could have done so many more Q banks or practice exams in that time, and I think reading the books was a huge waste of time. So 0 out of 10, would not recommend. And my reasoning for this, aside from the huge time sink that reading 7 big textbooks is one, you're exposed to the source material in your undergrad courses, so really you don't need to read these books. I could maybe understand if you're like me and you hadn't taken biochem and you want to read the biochem book, okay, there's probably better resources to use to get this done, but I would understand that more. But if you've taken all of the other classes, don't waste your time reading the books on those same classes. You've already been exposed to the material, and this leads into my second point. Reading these textbooks is passive learning, and what we want to be striving for is active learning. And the amount of information in these textbooks is also considerable, so by the time you get done with the 7th book, how much are you actually remembering from the first one, especially because, again, you're just passively intaking this information. So if you're like me and you had not previously taken something like biochem and you want to read that specific book and leave out the rest, I mean, okay, but there's probably still better ways to do it that incorporate active learning rather than passive learning through just reading. All in all, I really just wouldn't recommend wasting your time reading the books, and there may be plenty of people that disagree with me out there, but I think your time is better spent doing other things. Number 2 of things that I would not do, at least personally, is that I would not waste any time or money on these online or in-person MCAT courses, whether self-directed or otherwise. And really, they're just so expensive and so time-consuming that I think your time and money are spent better elsewhere. So overall, I would not recommend it. Number 3 on the list of things that I would not choose to do is likely to be very controversial among pre-meds and medical students because I know they love this, and that is I would not choose to use Anki, or at least I would not choose to use my own cards. And the reason being that I wasn't good at it, and this may change if I spent more time to get better at it, but I wasn't, so it just represented such a huge time suck on my end that I would not do it again. And maybe I would choose to use a pre-made deck, but again, that took a lot of time to cut it down and actually reduce it to what I actually needed compared to what you started with. And if Memm by Med School Insiders had not come out, maybe I would have stuck with that, and I very well might in the future if they didn't have an application like Memm. While I'm sure that there are plenty of people out there that are masters at Anki and they can make incredible cards that are very effective and efficient, it's just not something that I would personally use again. Transitioning into the things that I would do if I could go back in time, I probably would use Memm again because it was a good application in my opinion that allowed for spaced repetition learning, and honestly, once again, I just wouldn't be interested in going back and making my own cards, so I like the aspect that these cards were already pre-made. Assuming I still had areas of unfamiliarity, such as biochem, assuming I had not taken that class still, I would, rather than reading the book, I would probably look online for certain resources and largely look up quality videos on YouTube. I say quality because there's obviously going to be plenty out there that's not going to do anything for your MCAT score, but you have to be able to sort of decipher the good from the bad and take away what you can. Stemming from that second point on something that I would do again is I would continue drawing the biochemical pathways. I think that that was very helpful, especially on a subject like biochemistry that I had no prior formal education on. Last but not least, and this is the biggest one, so I really want to emphasize this, is question banks / practice tests. This is what you should be spending, in my opinion, the overwhelming majority of your time on. In my own personal experience, although I did only take 4 practice exams, there was a direct correlation between the number of exams that I took and my score, such that basically every time I took a test, my score increased. And so I believe that if I would have taken more, my score would have gone up each time accordingly. In addition to developing a more proficient understanding of the source material, there's something to be said about developing the skill of actually taking the test itself, and that can only be done by taking more practice questions and more practice exams. So do the Q banks and practice exams and then go back and review. Review the questions that you got wrong and then also the questions that you got right, just in case you got them right for the wrong reason. And then once you're done reviewing, go take more exams and do more questions. You'll not only learn the material better by doing this, but you'll also learn how they apply it to the exam itself. So the biggest thing I can tell you is to do more Q banks and to take more practice exams. This is really going to give you the biggest ROI in my opinion. Moving into some final thoughts and take-home points that you can actually use to apply to your own study program. Number 1, you really just don't need fancy things like these expensive and time-consuming books and courses. You just really don't. Your time and money is spent better elsewhere. Number 2 is to focus on active, not passive learning. So this could be Anki for those of you who do feel comfortable making your own cards, or something like Memm, which was my preference. Number 3, more and more practice questions. Number 4, if your schedule permits, you really should take these classes prior to taking the MCAT. For instance, for me personally, there's not a day that I walk into biochem where I don't say something along the lines of, well, that would have been very helpful to know for the MCAT. So if you can take the classes, I highly recommend doing it. And that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you've gone through this process and you have something that you found works for you, go ahead and comment below. If you're going through this process or you're getting ready to and you have questions, please go ahead and comment below with those as well. And if anyone out there has any requests for something they might like to see in regard to my pre-med or medical journey, please go ahead and comment below and let me know what you want to hear about. I'm here to help. So thanks again, guys. I will look forward to seeing you in the next one.